Hello everybody, welcome to the Unique History channel. Today, we will be discussing Greater Syria and the SSNP, also known as the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. The books that we will be discussing today are Greater Syria, The History of an Ambition by Daniel Pipes, and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, Its Ideology and History by Salim Mujais. So, we will start by defining what and where is Greater Syria. For many of you, you probably have heard the term the Middle East or the Near East, or the Levant. So, Greater Syria essentially is the entire Levant ruled out of Damascus, Syria, with Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, and a small part in Turkey as well. So, as you have seen in front of you, the map is the SSNP and the Greater Syria goal of having the entire Greater Syrian region, as they see the Levant, under their control. Of course, they would not be the only political party or movement to call the Levant theirs or want complete control, as many other movements, whether religious or somewhat secular, would also join them, such as the Arab Ba'athist Party, which means Arab Renaissance, and also, in some forms, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of Britain and France. Now, originally, the French were not privy to Greater Syria. Neither were the British after they had kicked out the imperialist Ottoman Empire and became the new imperial powers in the region. And with that, they began to divide the Levant, or Greater Syria, along lines that would seemingly benefit their interests. There were already sort of areas drawn out, but they weren't really seen as anything, people didn't really care. So, when the Imperial British and French got in control of the area, they began to draw up borders and boundaries of these places. Even, I believe, the country of Jordan itself was made or named by Winston Churchill, if I'm not mistaken here. So the Levant becomes this, the Levant becomes this sort of odd place once the Ottoman Turks are kicked out. So I'm going to be reading first from the book Greater Syria. Again, with these books, we're not endorsing the authors or all of their political views. We're just reading. So, in the beginning, you had the Syrian kingdom, which was a shabby obscurity of an Ottoman province. And then it says, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of May 1916, it divided Syria with France. In the Balfour Declaration of November 1917, endorsed the establishment of Palestine for a national homeland for Jewish people. Originally, France strongly protested against any idea of dividing Syria. Syria had geographical and historical unity. Basically, it was kind of hard in the beginning how they were going to handle this region. The French claimed that they were protecting the Christians of the Levant. So in the Levant, there's different types of Christian. There's the Syrian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox, and there are the Maronites, and I believe over in Iraq you have the Chaldeans and Assyrians as well, making up the main Christian minorities. The French had a concern for the Maronites, and it must not be underestimated. The creation of Lebanon fulfilled the Maronite dream, and other divisions of French Syria reduced the Muslim threat to the Lebanese independence. That did not reflect British imperial needs. By 1923, two European powers had divided it into 8 regions. In 1949, it had become 4 independent countries, 2 run by Muslims, Syria, Transjordan, 1 by Christians, Maronites, Lebanon, and 1 by Jews, Israel, while smaller parts were ruled by Turkey and Egypt. Although control from Paris and London ended long ago, the heritage of their imperial needs continued to dominate the public life in the Levant. So, yeah, you have that. There's a whole bunch of different groups in the Levant or the Middle East. Certain groups wanted certain land to be boarded off more than others. You know, people were vying for control. Seeing how much control they could technically get by working within these systems. Like Maronite Lebanese separatism. Then you have, you know, what comes along as the SSNP, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. And it's most active from 1932 to 1973. Again, I'm reading still from Greater Syria, the history of the ambition, or of an ambition. And it says that this SSNP, or the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, was created by Antun Sahada, a Greek Orthodox intellectual, and he founded the party in Beirut as a secret organization of students in November 1932. He served as the organization's leader until 1949, and the party generally closely reflected his personality and ideas. After that, the party was led by mediocre figures for a long time. It was a fascist party calling for the radical reform of society, separation of mosque, church, and state, prohibition of clergy interfering in politics, removal of barriers between sects, abolition of feudalism, and the forming of a strong army. Again, it had a curved swastika called the Red Hurricane, or the Swahaba. And yeah, it seeked to unite all of the Levant under rule from I believe, Damascus, Syria. Now, moving on to the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, its ideology and history, by Salim Mujais. We'll take a closer look at what the SSNP really stood for, since this book is more about the SSNP. So, the SSNP aims to show the Syrians that the realities of their history are reasons for pride, self-respect, and eagerness to restore Syria to its creative role in human civilization. Antoine Sahada did not buy into minority grievances. He understood them, but he didn't buy into them, because he knew that the French and the British, and other people probably too, could use them. He was strongly against colonialism being an act of violence perpetrated by aggressor nations, vanquished nations, to mount a counter-array of strength to resist and end colonial aggression. The SSNP had to conflict the targeting of its nation by the European colonial powers, France and England, aggressive endeavors by neighboring states bent on territorial expansion, Turkey, Arabia, and Egypt, and an organized settler colonialism by a global Zionist organization. So basically, the SSNP also pushed the thing that Syria, or what would become Israel, is southern Syria. And not only would the SSNP fully push this, but also Hafez al-Assad's party, the Ba'athist Party, the Arab Ba'athist Party. So the SSNP and the Ba'athists had a complicated history. They didn't always agree. But when Hafez al-Assad took over, they definitely worked together. Greater Syria was becoming more and more of a reality. It talks about this in both of the books, whether it's Greater Syria or the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, its ideology and history. Hafez al-Assad was not sold on every single part of Greater Syria, but definitely the rule from Damascus, ruling over what would be Palestine, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon. Making the claim there's no difference between Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians, and Iraqis. Before the Sykes-Picot agreement, they didn't see those differences. So the SSNP also went around to diaspora communities in Latin America and North America, I believe, to get support for their party. And, people that maybe were living abroad or working abroad, or that eventually wanted to move back. That they would advocate for a new Levant, a new Syria, where everyone would be sort of allowed to have their rights. As time went on, eventually the French and British troops left, I believe in the 40s, I want to say, and the leader of the SSNP, the original one, I believe he was killed by the colonial authorities. The SSNP had some other interesting people in it, some women as well. It was very strong with women's rights. It was not in any way saying that women, should go and act in certain ways, but it was definitely pro-woman. Yeah, so the SSNP essentially was very popular also during the Lebanese Civil War. Many people were willing to go and kill and blow themselves up for the idea of Greater Syria. It sort of became a rallying point. Some other people that supported the idea of Greater Syria would be Faisal ibn Hussein, and Abdullah, his brother. I believe they lived in either Iraq or what would be called Transjordan, so they were also supportive of the Greater Syria idea. Don't really know if it was the SSNP or not. The only really Syrian president, Hafez al-Assad, who I believe came to rule in 1974, he adopted Pan-Syrianism. I'm reading again from Greater Syria, The History of an Ambition. The Ba'ath and the SSNP cooperated as never before. They would no longer be enemies. After decades of competition, they worked out a mutually beneficial accommodation, whereas the SSNP became a client of the Syrian state. So it talks a little bit about the Lebanese Civil War as well. And it says, is there a difference between Lebanon and Syria? Conversely, a 16-year-old Lebanese girl who attacked an Israeli convoy in April 1985 with a booby-trapped car, killing herself and two Israeli soldiers, previously made a videotape where she sends all greetings to strugglers of my nation, headed by a leader of liberation and steadfast march, General Hafez al-Assad. It talks about the attempts at reunification by Hafez al-Assad's regime or government, whatever you want to call it, to sort of take the areas of what would be southern Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, although it never came to fruition. Still very interesting and eye-opening piece of history. That's what we're about at Unique History. Unique history. History you might not have heard in other places, and history you might not know. Again, putting all these historical videos into a shortened version where we do book summaries, look at things in history. So, lastly, I'm going to read you from the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, its ideology and history. I'm going to read you the basic principles. Syria is for Syrians, and Syrians are a complete nation. Syria, the Syrian cause, is an integral national cause, completely independent from any other cause. The Syrian cause is the cause of the Syrian nation and the Syrian homeland. The Syrian nation is the unity of the Syrian people, which developed through a long history. The Syrian homeland is that geographical environment in which the Syrian nation evolved. It has distinct natural boundaries and extends from the Tartus Range in the northwest and the Zagros Mountains in the northeast to the Suez Canal and the Red Sea in the south, and includes the Sinai Peninsula, the Gulf of Aqaba, from the Syrian Sea in the west, including the island of Cyprus, to the arch of the Arabian Desert and Persian Gulf in the east. This region is also known as the Syrian Fertile Crescent. The sixth principle, Syrian nation is one society. The seventh principle, the Syrian social nationalist movement derives its inspiration from the talents of the Syrian nation and its culturally and political national history. The eighth basic principle, Syria's interest supersede every other interest. And those are the basic principles. Now we'll read the reform principles. So the first reform principle is separation of religion and state. The second reform principle is debarring the clergy from interference in political and judicial matters. And the third reform principle is the removal of barriers between the various sects and confessions. The fourth reform principle is the abolition of feudalism, the organization of a national economy based on production, and the protection of rights and labor and the interests of the nation and the state. The fifth reform principle, formation of strong armed forces that will be effective in determining the destiny in the nation of the homeland. And that is all. So thank you for watching this short book summaries on Greater Syria. And again, the books are Greater Syria, The History of an Ambition, and it's by Daniel Pipes. It's published by Oxford University Press. And the other book is The Syrian Social Nationalist Party, Its Ideology and History by Salim Mujais, and it's published by Black House Publishing. I'll put both titles in the description of the video. I just want to thank you for stopping by and listening to Unique History, and I will have more videos on different subjects of other things you might find interesting, and short summaries on things. So thank you for coming by.